with that. I'm not seeing anybody else jumping on quite yet, but if anybody else does, then they'll just catch up with where we are. So Kathy, before I go through like the entire purchase agreement, are there any parts that you have particular questions about? Or do you want me to just go straight from the beginning?
There was one thing that was added, and I don't remember. Like I read blank this, I don't know if this is the question, but on page 3, it says buyer elects, buyer does not elect a limited home warranty from, if the buyer's not getting it, then I just leave it blank.
Yeah, I either leave it, I like to put something in no matter what, like if there's a spot, but you can leave it blank too. I just do not applicable.
Or NA, yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
NA.
I don't remember what my question was. I mean, you don't have to go over, everything like where the parcel number is, or, I just, oh, there's, no, okay, this is a question I have. Earnest money. Or says note to be redeemed with escrow agent within 4 days of acceptance. When the title agency gets the escrow money, the people usually deposit it online.
A lot of times, yeah.
I usually check note to be redeemed with escrow agent within 4 days from acceptance, but I don't put a note in there. I don't put a
You don't
separate
use the promissory note.
Should I be putting the promissory note in there?
It's probably a good idea to, just so listing agents don't question it. But it is nice because it gives you like that little bit of a window. And if you're going to check that, then you might as well just write out the promissory note really quickly because it doesn't take much time.
Okay.
And that way it's at least acts as a placeholder. I'm actually surprised if you've done that and not included a note that the agents haven't said anything, but maybe they just, they're like, it's a piece of paper. It doesn't really do anything anyway. But yes, so whichever one you choose here on lines 46 to 48, it says the escrow agent will confirm receipt of earnest money by delivering written notice to the real estate agents or to a party if they're not represented. On lines 46 and 47 there. So they should definitely be letting you know. It says it right in the contract when that is deposited. So whether that is the online tools, which a lot of companies have now, and that's super helpful, or if they receive a check or they receive a wire or whatever the case may be.
Okay. Running application. Okay, I'm just going to ask you all my dumb questions, if that's okay.
That's okay.
Because this offers condition financing upon buyer making written application for the above mortgage loan within blank days after acceptance. Okay, well, if they've gotten pre-approved, they've already made application, right? Or
so this is the formal loan application where they order appraisal, do the whole deal, start, figuring out, like initiating the process with that exact property.
Okay, then it says, good faith efforts to obtain a written commitment for that loan by, isn't that like right before it closes?
About a week or so before closing.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that I was doing it right. Okay. We place an escrow with the lending institution or the escrow agent. Okay, on or before. And so that one, the closing, all the documents on or before, that's just like a couple days before closing, right?
Yeah, that's pretty much your closing date. So,
That's the closing date, okay.
mhm. And then title transfers usually the next day. It's very rare to be able to get it to transfer the same day unless the property's vacant and both parties sign super early in the morning.
Okay,
Sometimes it can happen. It just, and it just depends. But I typically put the next day because
okay,
it says on or about. So
okay.
if for some reason it's able to close and file on the same day, then you're
Mhm.
covered because it says on
Okay.
or about.
And most of my transactions have been listings. So here in Cleveland, it's different, in different states. Do people generally get radon inspections here? Or some do and some don't?
It's highly recommended. I usually recommend it to my clients. We have like a lot of, I believe it's granite in like
Mhm.
underneath our soil. And so that causes higher levels for that to occur. So I always tell them that it's a great idea to do it because then if it needs to be mitigated, it costs $800 to $1,000 and it's a health and safety issue. So sellers are likely to take care of it because they would have to disclose that if it went back on the market.
Okay.
Mhm.
Is there, I don't even know what a water potability inspection is.
That would be for a property that is well and septic. So the water potability, that's like making sure there's no weird bacteria or anything like that in the water. The county will do a test of the water. They'll test it for lead. They'll test it for a variety of bacteria that make it unsafe to drink. So it's just making sure that the water in that well is not contaminated.
Okay,
So that and the septic and the well flow rate is making sure that the well pump is working properly and that your machinery for the well, and also that there's enough water in the well. So when you have a well inspection, they will run the water out of every faucet in the house just to make
okay,
sure that they're still getting good pressure. And
okay.
that's how they determine if the well flow rate is good.
So if there's a well, then you want the water potability and the well flow rate done.
Definitely. Mhm.
Okay. Septic system, you only want that if it's on septic.
Correct. And a lot of
Mhm.
times it's either been initiated with the county already or it's they're at least they're aware that it needs to be done. So like Geauga County, that is required for it to be able to sell. So a lot
Oh,
of times the
really?
seller will have already gotten that done or be in the process. Like at this time of year, they're not able to do septic inspections because of the moisture in the ground. And like in most cases, it's still frozen.
Mhm.
I mean, it snowed a week ago. So
Yeah.
a lot of times they're not able to, and they give you like a time amount that you would have to get that done. And in that case, we do have a septic addendum, which allows you to escrow money to take care of any problems with the septic that could take place. Another issue with septic is if it is a vacant property, you cannot test a septic system for functionality if nobody's been using it. So in that case, you would also want to hold back some money from the seller's proceeds until the septic has been occupied. Some counties say 60 days. I think some even say 90, but I'm not 100% sure. So don't quote me on that. But they want to see that it's being used regularly before they will test it.
And how much money would you suggest they hold back?
That's a tough one. A lot of people will write it as 1.5 times the amount of the cost of a new septic system because there are a ton of different types of septic systems. Depending on the soil in the lot, it could be a different kind. So there are a couple different kinds. It can cost probably between 15,000 and 25,000. I see a lot of people just write in that 25,000 to escrow it because of the fact that if it's, you know, vacant, or if it is not able to be tested at that time, you want to make sure that because that's a pretty large expense.
Okay, so they escrow 25,000.
Mhm.
What if they don't get 25,000 back? Then, like, say it's somebody that they're just breaking even, or get 5,000 out of it. If there isn't 25,000, can you not do the deal?
A lot of times in those situations, they will say, septic must be accepted as is. I've seen that before. I don't know if anybody else has had that experience before, but I certainly have, where they say the funds are not available to replace the septic if needed. So, like, please understand that you are accepting the septic as is. Hi, Crystal, welcome.
Hello, how are you?
Good. So we were just starting to go through. I'll just start right up at the top now that we kind of have covered a couple of questions along the way. And feel free, this is super informal. Feel free to interrupt if you have any questions throughout this, and let's just make it conversational. So we're going over the offer to purchase, which was just revised in September. So up at the top, pretty self-explanatory. You'd put the buyer's names, the property, the city, and then the parcel number, which you can find in the multiple listing service.
Wait, I have a question with all these. Am I missing it, or there's not a date? There's no place to write the date. You only have the date. I mean, at the end of the contract, when you sign it, the date goes with it, but there isn't a place like at the top to write the date. And like in Atlanta, they give you a specific time, like, but the offer to purchase, they don't give you, like, say this expires in 24 hours or 48 hours. Right.
And you can certainly add that to the additional terms at the end. What I have found in my experience is that giving deadlines right now is not super effective.
Well, now wouldn't be effective.
Yeah.
No, but just in general, I just wanted to make sure I'm not missing something.
Nope, we don't have that on ours, and there are some contracts that do, but I'll show you when we get to the end. I would recommend, if you're going to put a deadline, a lot of times people will put it in these lines here, and then this little tool here with the paint bucket, highlight it, and that way it's very apparent that there's a deadline on the property.
Oh, that's cool.
That's how I would recommend handling that. If your clients want to put a deadline, it's not something that we've really been seeing, just because, I mean, people have been doing it, but it's not always effective, just because the market has been so strong for sellers that they're just like, okay, if you want to put a deadline on it, I guess I'll just pass on your offer because I probably have 15 more like it. So, yeah, so parcel number, and then all of this is based on what is listed in the MLS. If you have any questions between what is listed in the MLS and what you saw when you're in the property, definitely recommend asking the listing agent to clarify. So sometimes they won't put washer and dryer in there. There might be a washer dryer in the property. You can always ask, say, hey, I noticed it doesn't say it in the MLS. I just want to clarify that washer and dryer are not included. So then you're able to put that in this fixtures area, fixtures excluded from this agreement, just to make sure that everyone is super clear. Your buyers are super clear that the washer and dryer or the refrigerator or whatever the case may be is not staying. In terms of chattel included in the agreement, that could be anything from a TV. I've seen people say, you know, it would be more work to take the TV down off of the mounts than it would be just to include it with the property. It would be more work to take down the play set in the backyard. So the one thing to be careful with on here is that if the lender sees that, they could be like, well, what's the value of that? Should it be included in the loan amount, which you don't love? So sometimes people will handle that on a separate addendum as well, just so that it's laid out between the two parties, but it wouldn't necessarily be a part of the contract. Fixtures excluded, that could be anything from like we were talking about appliances, sometimes people will say the chandelier is not included
Yeah.
because it's very sentimental to me, or whatever the reason might be. So that takes care of that section. Now, secondary offers. Who has ever written or submitted a secondary offer? Anybody?
I haven't written one, but I recently came into contact with an agent who was mentioning the possibility of secondary offers.
Cool. So what you would do in that case, a lot of times this happens when you lose out on multiple offers. You might come back and say, this is a secondary offer. And if it is, it will become the primary contract upon the buyer's receipt of a signed copy of the release of the primary contract on or before. And this allows them to set kind of a window where they're comfortable with the possibility of becoming first place. So say you find out on like a Sunday, you're not that you didn't win, that they're not really probably going to look at properties until Friday to go out on the weekend again. You could say, if something happens that this falls apart within the next 5 days, or some people will do 7 days just because it's likely that inspections would be done by then. If that happens, then we want to be in first place. So the buyer deposits the earnest money within 4 days from the date of receipt of the release, notifying the buyer that the buyer's contract with the seller is the primary contract. So the buyer may terminate this secondary contract at any time before their receipt of the release of the primary contract by delivering written notice to seller or seller's agent. So what does that word salad mean to you? Anybody know?
What was the question?
So what does this paragraph mean? Like, buyer may terminate this secondary contract at any time before their receipt of the primary contract by delivering written notice to the seller or seller's agents. So if your client has a secondary offer and they want to write an offer on something else,
then they just have to do a release or something.
They have to give written notice to the seller or seller's agent. So that could be passed along through email. Email is the best way to convey written notice that you could send to the seller's agent. Have your client email you, I am no longer interested in this property at 123 Main Street. Please rescind my offer, basically. That takes you out of the running for that property at that point. Because when you do a secondary offer, if they sign it as is and send it back to you with your seller's signatures when you've submitted it as a secondary, and you are under contract on another property already, then you're kind of under contract on 2 properties. And that's not good.
Hey, Katie, I have a question.
Yeah.
So so you've submitted the offer once before, they've gone with another offer. Would you just resubmit and check the secondary offer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Okay.
I recommend always kind of doing the download so that you save what has already been done. So like if you download it, then it preserves the signatures so that you can see what your first offer was, and then re-upload it to Dotloop, and then cross out and initial and do what you need to do there.
Okay.
Just, I'm a big fan of keeping record of what you had previously done. Ty, I saw you unmute. Did you have a question or something that you wanted to add?
No, I was just going to make a comment. Some years ago, I had a client, we were talking about secondary offers. We wanted to put in a secondary offer, but they wanted to continue to look and put in another offer on a property. And I was just saying, I warned them about that very thing that you just said, is that if they send that back, signed, and you sign another one, you're under contract, and
Yeah.
you're under contract for 2 homes.
And you could at the very least lose your earnest money.
Yeah,
If they're like really cranky, they could try to sue you. You don't want that.
correct.
So if it's all fine and good to do a secondary offer. Just make sure that if they want to write an offer on something else, you probably want to rescind that secondary offer. If that time has already expired, then it is null and void anyway. So just during that time, I tend to check in. If I do a secondary offer, I check in with the list agent and say, hey, you know, how I hope everything's going well, because you never want that type of karma in your life. But you know, do you think that there's any chance that we're going to become the primary offer? My client is really interested in looking at this other property. I just want to make sure that you know, we're in good shape there. So then this part is pretty self-explanatory, putting in the price, putting in the earnest money, either wire, which anything over $10,000 has to be wired, a check made payable to the escrow agent, or a note to be redeemed. So that would be the promissory note that is also in our files. And then you can have them submit it anyway, but that just gives you a little bit of time to get that under control. I especially recommend that if your client is going to be mailing a check. Hopefully they're overnighting it if they do that, and getting a receipt with it so that they're able to keep track of where that money is, because you definitely don't want to fall out of contract because of that. So then your cash down payment, I really try to encourage people to say, you know, if they think they're going to put down 20%, but they might do a little bit less based on whatever the purchase price is, I would say up to 20%. And then, or I'm sorry, at least if they know they're going to do 20, at least 20%. If they know they're going to do 20 and might do more or something like that, then you could say remainder. You can say, if they know they're going to do 20 and 80, you can do it that way. I just try to recommend not putting in like numbers. So don't put down 50,000 and like 100,000, because then if the purchase price changes, then you have to go back and change the contract technically for it to be accurate. So stick with percentages there. Some people will put to be determined and remainder. A lot of list agents don't like that. So just keeping that in mind, especially if you're in a competitive situation, that they might want more specific information about how your client's finances are going to play out with this. So then you'll mark what type of loan it is, conventional, FHA, VA. Keep in mind, if you have FHA or VA, there is a separate addendum that has to go along with it. And then cash, of course, we love that. Or other. So other could be a hard money loan. Other could be a USDA loan. There are certain like OFA, Ohio Financing Agency grants that could come into play here as well. So just gives you a little space to check it out. We talked just a bit ago about this paragraph here with the earnest money being delivered, the escrow agent delivering written notice to the real estate agents or to the party that the earnest money has been received. And again, it states that Ohio law requires the escrow agent to deposits in excess of $10,000 to be conveyed by wire transfer. This paragraph here, 50 to 54, lines 50 to 54, is our electronic data security disclaimer. So this takes the place of our wire fraud addendum that we had. You no longer have to use that form with listings actually or purchases. So this paragraph was added in September to kind of protect us a little bit extra. If you have someone who, you know, if you want that extra clarification, feel free to continue using the wire fraud addendum. It's just no longer required. And it just tells them not to listen to anybody who gives them different wiring instructions and releases the brokers and agents involved in the transaction from any and all claims, damages, and causes of action related to any unlawful electronic data security access by a third party. So our financing paragraph, this written application, that means they are moving forward with this property. They're probably ordering the appraisal pretty quickly. I tend to put anywhere from 5 to 7 days here. Keep in mind, if you are getting close to the weekend, if you're writing the offer on a Thursday, they're having answers by Friday evening. That eats up 2 of your days because these are calendar days, not business days. So just be cautious with that. Ty, you have something?
Yeah, I just want to go back to that buyer piece. Just make sure that your client know all the players in this process. So all your title people who will be contacting them. Of course, they would know the mortgage person, and that'll help them avoid that type of trickery. If they know all the players and make it clear to them who all the players are. And that way they will also come back to you and ask, is this person part of our transaction? Because I've had that happen.
100%. That's a great point. And encourage them to talk on the phone with the people too. Because with the phishing, now there's like this whole phishing thing that's been happening the last couple of years where hackers can even duplicate your email signature or the title company's email signature and make it seem like the email is legitimate. And the email address will be just like a little bit different. And so it's easy for someone to fall for that. So just really stress this to them and make sure they understand, especially if it's toward the end of the transaction and all of a sudden there are different wiring instructions. I would recommend that they verify that in 2 ways. Call the title company and also talk to you about it if there's something that seems strange. Just open up their eyes to the possibility that things are happening like that. Okay, great point. After they've done that application and the appraisal is ordered, their commitment for the loan is usually about a week or so before the closing date, if it's like a 30-day close. So if we were writing a contract today, that's April 12th, and we would say, well, I tend to push things to the next week, but when it falls on the end of the week like that. But let's just say for this example, maybe May 4th, we might say that they're going to have written commitment for the loan. That means everything's gone through underwriting. We are good to go. Then there's that 3 days that they have to have notice from the lender that that's what they're going to be, what the final terms of their loan will be. If they don't obtain timely written loan commitment, then the agreement is null and void, and the mutual release is signed and the earnest money is returned to the buyer. So this protects your buyer in the event that something goes wrong with their financing, they can at least get their earnest money back. In the event of a dispute regarding earnest money, the Ohio law requires the escrow agent to hold it in their trust account until the escrow agent receives a written mutual authorization of both parties specifying the disbursement or a court order directing the disbursement. That usually takes about 2 years if it has to go to that point. So ideally, you don't have any issues getting the money back for your client if that were to occur. For closing, this is where you would put whatever title company. So for the purposes of this contract, let's put not Ohio Realtors, Ohio Real Title on or before, and you would put your closing date as, let's just say it's going to be May 12th. I would say it's wise to try and keep it toward the beginning of the week, because then it gives you a little bit of time so that your people aren't stuck without a house over the weekend. So let's just say for the purposes of this, we're just going to push it to 5/17 and have title transfer. We were talking about this a little earlier on the call, but that's generally the next day. So we would put 5/18 then for our title transfer. For the walkthrough, I put a range just to make sure that you have a little bit of time. You want it to be pretty close to the time that title is going to transfer. So 1 to 3 days before title transfer is pretty much the standard. Sometimes people will go up to 5 days, but I think 1 to 3 is a pretty good time. And it is solely to verify that it is in the same or similar condition, absent normal wear and tear. If the buyer conducts a walkthrough, they will not raise issues about the condition of the property if that condition existed when the buyer last viewed or inspected it. And if the walkthrough evidences a material adverse change in the property's condition, the buyer will promptly notify the seller and escrow agent in writing of the material adverse change. And then the parties can agree whether the buyer will have a credit to repair the problem, or if it will be held in escrow from the seller's proceeds. So if the buyer does not conduct a walkthrough, it is the buyer's waiver of it and acceptance of the property and as is condition. So it's important to keep track of your dates when you are representing a buyer to make sure that you remind them, hey, we're about a week out from closing. Your walkthrough can be anywhere from 1 to 3 days before title transfer. Let's make sure that we get that scheduled, what times work for you, and I'll verify with the listing agent. Okay, possession. The seller will deliver possession and occupancy to the buyer on or before 6 p.m. Typically, what you'll see is 0 days after the recording of the deed from the seller to buyer, and then here I would just put that same title transfer date, whichever is later. The buyer will transfer utilities commencing on the date of possession. This is where you want to be careful if this happens, but often there is a need for the seller to retain possession for a day or so if they're buying a new property and selling their current property. So you might have it where it's 2 days after, and then you would say 5/20. If that happens, we do have a separate addendum called the seller occupancy after title transfer addendum, and you'll want to make sure that you have them take care of that. That form is meant only for a couple of days. If there's a discrepancy between title transfer and possession, if it's going to be longer than that, then the recommendation is that you have your client and the seller work out kind of a lease agreement on their own. Like some of these rent backs that are, 30, 60 days, there is a lot that can happen in that 30 to 60 days. So you really want to make sure that your client is protected and that you're protected as well. Title. Seller shall convey marketable title to the buyer by general warranty deed and or fiduciary deed if required, with the release of dower rights, because in Ohio we have dower rights where if someone is married, they have to be involved in the selling of a property, even if it's only in one person's name. Free and clear of all liens and encumbrances whatsoever, except any mortgage assumed by the buyer, restrictions, conditions, easements, however created, and encroachments as do not materially adversely affect the use or value of the property, any zoning ordinances, if they exist, and then taxes and assessments, both general and special, not yet due and payable. The seller will furnish the owner's fee policy of title insurance from the escrow agent for the purchase price with the cost of the insuring premium. This is important, split equally between the seller and buyer. So in Ohio, it's customary for the insurance premium for title insurance to be split equally between the seller and buyer. The seller will have 30 days after written notice to remove any title defects. And if they're not able to do that, the buyer can either accept the title subject to each defect without a reduction in the purchase price or terminate the agreement. And if they do choose to terminate the agreement based on any title issue, the parties agree to sign a mutual release authorizing the earnest money to be released to the buyer. Title is a lot. So if you have questions about that, we have a great partner in Janelle Kiefer at Ohio Real Title. And I'm going to try and get her to teach some more classes and things like that, because there's a lot of information to learn about title. And I'm not an expert, and it's hard to be an expert with that when you don't deal with it on the day-to-day. So prorations, if it is tenant occupied, then the security deposit is credited to the buyer through escrow. Rents, if any, taxes, assessments, homeowners association fees and assessments, prorated by the escrow agent as of the date of title transfer. Taxes and assessments shall be prorated based on the latest available tax duplicate. The parties shall consult directly with the escrow agent and or county auditor's office about the property taxes, as the latest available tax duplicate may not accurately reflect the amount of taxes owed, because our taxes are 6 months in arrears. The parties shall adjust directly any changes in proration when the tax duplicate for the calendar year of title transfer becomes available. And this is something that I actually never knew about until I ran into it last year. If the property is new construction and recently completed or in the process of completion, then the escrow agent shall make a good faith estimate of taxes to be owed on the value of the improved property from the date of title transfer, and reserve sufficient funds in escrow from the net proceeds to pay those taxes after title transfer. The escrow agent is instructed to release the balance of the funds on reserve upon notice from the county auditor that taxes on the land and improvements have been paid in full to the date of title transfer. Escrow agent shall withhold how much? I usually do about $250. Ty, what do you do? About the same? $150 to $250, depending on if it's vacant. Probably about. If your property is on septic and well, you do not need to escrow money. I did that accidentally one time, didn't even think about it. And then I was like, well, that wasn't necessary. But yeah, so anywhere from $150 to $250 if it's vacant, probably a little bit less. But that just protects you with that final reading.
And Kady, I was driving in on mute, so.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I do anywhere from 250 to 5.
Yeah, just depends on the property too. Like if
Right.
you know, aren't sure if it's been, you know, tenant occupied or something like that, you might have no idea. Like it just depends. You want to make sure that you protect your client as the buyer to make sure that you've escrowed enough money to cover any outstanding water bills and sewer bills. Okay. And then the charges go back to the seller's, the balance would go back to the seller once those final readings are paid. If it is deemed subject to any agricultural tax recoupment, the buyer or seller agrees to pay the amount of such recoupment. Don't come up against this often, but I always just select seller to protect my client. I really have not experienced that. But if you get out into more rural areas, that is something you could encounter. Any questions so far? I feel like I'm just talking and talking and talking. Okay. All right, charges and escrow instructions. This agreement shall be used as escrow instructions subject to the escrow agent's standard conditions of acceptance, not inconsistent with this agreement. So this covers all of the things that the seller pays through escrow, the transfer tax, the mortgage and any liens or encumbrances that are not the buyers, that are not being assumed by the buyers, the title exam, and 1/2 of that insurance premium for owner's fee policy of title insurance, any prorations due to the buyer. So that would be taxes, anything that you were paying, that the seller was paying in closing costs, things of that nature. The broker commissions, and then 1/2 of the escrow, unless VA or FHA regulations prohibit payment of escrow fee by buyer, in which case the seller would pay the entire escrow fee. And the seller shall directly pay all utility charges to the date of title transfer or the date of possession, whichever is later. Tenant security deposits, if any, again, will be credited to in escrow to the buyer. The buyer pays through escrow, again, unless prohibited by FHA or VA, 1/2 of the escrow fee, 1/2 of the insurance premium, all recording fees for any deed or mortgage, and then the buyer's agent commission. This is a newer part too, just with all the antitrust lawsuits and everything that NAR is facing. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see even more protections the next time we have to redo this. But the buyer's agent commission is comprised of 2 components: the cooperative compensation payable from the listing brokerage. So that's what you see from the MLS. And then $200, which is our office additional commission, which comes from the buyer through escrow. This paragraph is about the home warranty. You would just put in the home warranty company, the home warranty cost, who's paying for it, and then acknowledgement that the warranty does not cover pre-existing defects and allows the buyer and requires the buyer to pay a deductible in the event of a claim. And the broker or its agents may receive a fee from the warranty provider. So with America's Preferred Home Warranty, we do have the opportunity to make a little compensation. If you order a warranty through them, it's $50 once the office takes. It's split 50-50. It's $100 total, split between the office and the agent. Okay, this is a very important part, everything about inspections, removing liability from us as the agents, that we are not telling them who to use. We're giving them recommendations, and we are always giving them 3 recommendations at minimum for any contractor, any inspector, any lender, anything. You should always give at least 3. So we are putting them responsible for choosing and retaining any inspector, contractor, or service provider. And the buyer acknowledges that if they don't do this, if they don't do inspections, that is against our advice, against our broker's advice, and against our advice. And the buyer is advised that real property could have hidden defects and conditions. So they must inspect and make diligent inquiry about the property, including land, dwelling, and any improvements. The buyer will inspect and evaluate all aspects of the property and retain independent professionals to do so. And here's where it says that it's a general home inspector licensed by the state of Ohio. That went into effect last July. They must be licensed. And if you need to find licensed inspectors, we have a whole list of them available on our KW Living shared drive in Google Drive. So let me know if you don't have access to that and I can get you added. And also you can go on the Ohio Division Real Estate site and look up a license, at which point you're able to look up an inspector by name and make sure that they're licensed. Okay. And telling them that they need to look at public records, etc. The buyer will review any representations and disclosures and make inquiry of the seller if additional information is deemed necessary for their due diligence. The buyer doesn't rely on written or verbal representations of the brokers and agents, and they agree to hold us harmless in this agreement from any claims, actions, injuries, or damages due to them not doing an inspector. And this is just a note that's important to point out, because people might think, well, if I'm buying FHA and having an appraisal, does that cover me? No, they're not looking into the in-depth things that a home inspector would look at. They're also not doing that on a home point of sale inspection. Even though some cities have a very in-depth inspection, it's still recommended to have an independent contractor that your buyer has hired to take a look at the property. Okay, your general home inspection, you've got your septic. We were talking about that a little bit earlier. Based on what county you're in, they could have certain inspectors that must complete the inspection in order for it to be acceptable to the county. And some of them, it's like a point of sale issue where it has to be done or the money has to be escrowed in order to sell. And then radon as well. So that's just that decomposing uranium. It's been known to be a carcinogen. I always recommend it just to cover my own butt, especially if they're planning on using the basement. But even in properties that are on a slab, there have been elevated levels of radon found.
Do they have, generally, they don't do pest inspections here? Or
So
like,
that is an
they don't do
option.
termites?
Yeah, that is, there are some parts where you definitely want to do that. Like the west side of Akron, like near west side of Akron, there are a lot of homes who have massive wood destroying insect problems. So the way I get around that without having them do it right away if they don't want to. So your general home inspection is going to be paid by the buyer generally. You want that within 7 to 10 days. If they want to do radon, you also want that within 7 to 10 days. That's always paid by the buyer as well. And then on line 154, I tend to put 14 days. You might tighten that up if you're in a super competitive situation and you want to make sure that you're fighting for your client and getting them the house, as recommended by general inspector. So this way, even if your client thinks, I don't want to get a wood destroying insect right off the bat because I don't see any reason that makes me think that, this protects them to be able to go back and do that after. Okay, so line 157 to 159, this is especially important. If you check no for all of these, you want to have your client initial that they're waiving the inspections and they're accepting the property in as-is condition. And then within 3 days, the buyer can elect only one of the following options. So either they're removing the...
Wait, can I ask you a question about what you
Sure.
just said?
Sure.
Because it says, I read it different, buyer expressly waives each and every professional inspection buyer has not elected. So I
Right.
always have them initial it, even though they've elected the general inspection,
Yeah.
but they haven't elected some of the others.
Right. So the reason I was saying that, to make sure that it's as is, if they have said no to every inspection, because that's something that's happening, that listing agent is going to want to see that that's initialed there as well. But yes, you're correct that it is anything that is not elected to be done. So because we have other checked and as recommended, that should protect them in that situation if they want to go back and do others. So within 3 days from the dates, they accept it as is. They ask for certain repairs or, a credit or whatever the case may be. And then they also have the option to terminate the agreement if there are just too many problems and they don't want to move forward. So if they accept the property in as is condition, then they'll sign that amendment to purchase agreement, which is our removal of inspection contingency. And the agreement just moves forward, which is always a happy day. We like that. If the property is accepted subject to certain repairs, then the buyer provides the seller with a copy of the inspection report and the removal of contingency amendment to purchase agreement, identifying any defects that need to be repaired. Then they have 3 days to come to an agreement. And if they do not come to an agreement in writing about what the seller is willing to fix and what the buyer is willing to assume, then the mutual release is signed and the earnest money goes back to the buyer. So that protects your buyer in the event that something crazy comes up on the inspection, that they're able to get their earnest money back. If they elect to terminate the agreement, then also the earnest money goes back to the buyer. And it's again, a good idea to provide proof of anything major that is found that is the reason your buyer is backing out. You want to provide that proof from the home inspection. The parties can modify dates for inspections, repairs, or the deadline by mutual written agreement. So if you're having trouble getting an inspector out for some reason, they can agree between the two parties that they're willing to extend that deadline out a couple of days or whatever you need to do. Here's our section about the pest and wood destroying insects. So either yes or no. This is who would choose the inspector or exterminating agency. And this is who would pay for it. So all of that is negotiable. If it's VA, then the seller is required to pay for that. And sometimes FHA, I've been seeing it too. Not always, but sometimes on FHA, they're requiring that. Okay. So this just goes through all the specifics about, there has to be a guarantee for a period of at least a year in the case of termites, if they do any extermination, and at least 60 days in the case of wood destroying insects. And then who's paying for the repairs? Again, unless FHA and VA regulations prohibit payment by the buyer, in which case the seller would bear the cost. This agreement may be terminated by the party paying for the repair and treatment if the cost exceeds $500. So that protects both parties from having to continue forward if it's going to be a massive repair. Okay, lead-based paint inspection. I don't see a lot of people do this just because it's an extremely expensive inspection to have done. If you know that there is lead-based paint in the property, like 100% it's on the disclosure, then it's probably worthwhile to do this to identify where it is and how much it would need to be mitigated. So that's just something to keep in mind throughout that. And then if they've received if they have lead-based paint, you should give them the EPA pamphlet, Protect Your Home from your family from lead in your home, and also that lead-based paint disclosure that's provided usually in the supplements in the multiple listing service. If they haven't received it, then this gives you time to say, you know what, we need that within 3 days from the receipt of the offer, just to make sure that your client still has the opportunity to back out if they haven't received that information, and you just want to make sure that you've gotten that offer in. Megan's Law, so that's everything about sexual offenders. So just encourage your client to take a look, make sure that they are comfortable with who their neighbors are. Condition of property, the buyer has examined the property and agrees to purchase it in present physical as is condition with any latent defects and defects disclosed on the residential property disclosure. So the seller shall promptly notify the buyer in writing if anything else happens to the house that's a major defect between acceptance and the date of recording of the deed. So in that case, if you're representing the seller, you would do an addendum to the residential purchase or the residential property disclosure, just adding anything additional that happens. So if they have water come into the basement all of a sudden, you want to have them explain what happens. So this is if they have received it. This is if they have not received the property disclosure. And again, I would say within 3 days at maximum, you want that information as soon as you can have it, just so that you can determine if your buyer is going to be willing to move forward. Okay, how we doing? Any questions? I feel like I'm just talking, so if anybody has questions, please let me know.
You're doing a fantastic job. Keep going.
All right, thank you. Yeah, feel free to stop me at any time. But this line 234, the property will be delivered in broom clean condition, free and clear of all debris and chattel. And the seller will pay for any repair of gas line leak that is found between the street and the foundation at the time of the transfer of utilities. Point of sale laws, ordinances, all of that, the seller should comply, and the buyer should inquire directly with the local government if they wish to review any point of sale information and public records in the history of the property. So that's your buyer's due diligence. You should instruct them if they have questions about something with the property, whether it's zoning, whether it is, if permits were pulled for something in particular because something looks shady. You want them to get that information. You don't want to get that for them because you want to make sure that they are satisfied with that information. The seller represents that they have not received any notices about building code or health and safety violations, except as they've already disclosed. And if it applies, the buyer and seller will have, gosh, I usually put 5 days here in case there's some huge point of sale issue that comes up and you need to take time to get estimates from the approved contractors, things of that nature. From the time that you have received, when the buyer has received any report, they can have 5 days to agree in writing which party will be responsible for any building code or health violations. And if they can't agree in that time period, again, the agreement is null and void. Can be declared null and void by either party. We're almost there. Representations and disclaimers. This is just stating that the seller completed the property disclosure without any of your assistance, because when you represent a seller, you shouldn't touch that thing. You want nothing to do with it. They need to fill that out as completely and honestly as they possibly can. And you don't want to have anything to do with it at all. If they have a question about like what a question means, maybe, but don't say, if they say, should I put this? It was 6 years ago. Say you should be as honest as possible on this form and leave it at that because you don't want to get in trouble with that by not disclosing something that should have been disclosed. The parties hereby, go ahead.
I'm gonna go back up to that previous one.
Mhm.
So you actually use this section to cover your POS?
Yeah, if the POS hasn't been ordered, especially, I just always put that in there to be safe. Because if we already know, then great. And if something comes up later, then we're even more covered. So
Okay.
to me, it just makes sense because it doesn't hurt anything. Most of the time listing agents probably don't even like care that it's there, but I care. So I just do it to make sure that it's like extra protection. If anything comes up later in the transaction that they're like, oh, well, this needs to be fixed, or, you're not going to be able to transfer the property, then you have a couple days built in there as well to make sure you're set.
Because I always put, when I'm doing removal of contingency form, and the POS is not completed, I always add that, make that part of that form.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Removal of contingency, I always put that in there.
That's a great idea. You definitely, especially if it's not done at that point, that is still a huge deal that you want to make sure that your client is going to be covered.
Absolutely.
Great point. Okay.
But I like this too.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't hurt. It takes 5 seconds just to type it in there, and then it gives you another layer of protection. You might as well. So, okay. And pretty much all of this is the legal stuff that we have to say to make sure that they know that we did not give them any representations. They're responsible for doing their own due diligence. The property disclosure is as accurate as we know it could be, but we don't know if they lied because we're not in their heads. So this is just a bunch of that's saying, hey, we're doing what we can to be honest here, but we can't guarantee that. Damage, if the improvements are either destroyed or damaged in excess of 10% of the purchase price before title transfer, then the buyer can either accept the insurance proceeds for the damage and complete the transaction, or terminate the agreement and receive the return of all deposits made. And if the damage is less than 10%, then the seller should just go ahead and return it to prior condition. So they're moving, a hole gets in the drywall. They should probably just take care of that because that's not going to be that expensive. But it is expected to be taken care of. Here's your addenda and related documents. Always your agency disclosure. That should be the first form that you submit in an offer. In the order, you want it to be agency disclosure first. You want your property disclosure, VA if that applies, FHA if that applies. This 4-year protection, get a home inspection. We require it for our office compliance right now. It doesn't have to be submitted to the listing agent or a part of the contract. The reason we made the decision to require that is because there have been so many people who have been waiving inspections. So again, we're just trying to protect the agents in our office as much as we possibly can. So that form is really just saying, hey, I told you to have a home inspection. Here's proof that we talked about it. That's all it is. Condo addendum, if there's an HOA or it's a condo. House sale contingency, if you're selling a house at the same time that you're trying to buy it and you need to sell the first house in order to get the second house. House sale concurrency, if they're on the market at the same time and you're just working through both sales at the same time. Lead-based paint, if it was built before 1978 or before, I should say. And then other. Here's where you could put your escalation addendum. Here's where you could put the appraisal gap addendum, anything like that that might also apply. This is also where, since we don't currently on this version of the contract have somewhere to put closing costs, people, if you're asking for sellers to pay closing costs, the recommendation from our broker is either to add a text box here. And again, you can use that fun highlighting tool here, the paint bucket, just so that it stands out, or you can add that verbiage down here in other. Or if you wanted, like Kathy was saying, to put a deadline on it or anything like that. This just states that it's a binding agreement. It defines that the days are calendar days, like we were discussing with that financing contingency. It's not business days, it's calendar days. Everything there is just, again, it is all binding. Legally binding contract, get an attorney if you want. Buyer signs here, you'll put your info here. Earnest money receipt. Don't sign this unless you have it in your hands, or if you're doing the note, the promissory note, you can sign it. Otherwise, unless you have the check physically in your hand, don't sign this. Don't sign this part, because then if for some reason the earnest money is not collected or gets lost in the mail, something like that, they could say, well, where's the earnest money? You said that you had it. You said that you were acknowledging receipt. And then acceptance, there's your the seller's signature, the listing agent information. Here we have this pre-filled with our brokerage license number. You would put your stuff in here. That's it. Any questions? Cool. Anything else before we jump off?
Only question I have is this recorded? And if so, are you sending it out?
It is recorded and Garrell will
Okay.
send it out. It takes like, usually like almost 24 hours for the recording to populate on Zoom, but it will be available, and it'll also be on the KW Agents Guide website.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kady.
And I try to do these like once a month. I try to mix it up between evenings, weekends, and then some during the day, just so that people who aren't able to join us during the week will be able to get some education as well. So, all right. Thanks for jumping
Thank
on,
you.
everybody.
Thank you so
you.
much.
The weather. It's so nice outside. I can't believe it.
Mhm.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.